Minority communities all around the world are dying, are going away. What Op would have you suggest is to take one organ of those minority communities and to try to preserve it very nicely in a glass jar so that future generations can maybe look at it. But what we propose on government is to reinvigorate the blood into those communities, to revitalize them with agency and with economic prosperity so that they themselves can decide how they want to fulfill every single aspect of their communal living. That is including culture, but not limited to it. What is this debate about and what is it not about? We say this debate is not about how much money we invest in minority communities. Clearly, both sides want to invest more money in minority communities, and that's going to be symmetrical. We are going to analyze why it's likely that over time you'll get a higher investment on our side than on the other side. But that can't be fiated by either side or demanded as a stance by either side, because we obviously all want it. Secondly, we say there's no fiat, especially no long-term fiat, on how that investment will actually come into play. That is, the incentives which shape how the investment in culture or in economic development are done is up for debate, is up for analysis on what are the political incentives involved in each one. What is this a big debate about then? Given a certain economic climate, at a certain point in time, how do we divide it between governmental investment in culture and governmental investment in economic development? We say it's best to invest entirely in economic development and leave the investment in culture to private investors and to the private market, to private NGOs, to private charities, etc., etc. So, firstly, I'll talk about where can actually government be more effective in the short and long terms, and secondly, what's more important truly here for the government to invest in, whether it is economic development or preservation of culture. And if you have any clarifications, guys, okay, good. So first, we say what's going to work. We say it's going to be significantly more successful over time to invest in the economic development. Few reasons for that. Firstly, external backlash or external resistance, that sort of investment. We say a lot of people don't understand why we should invest in minority communities, especially when those minority communities are often directly antithetical to the main community. Like, it's easy to look at African Americans in America and say, maybe that's not the case there, but clearly if you're looking at Arab communities in Israel, clearly if you're looking at minority Pakistani or Sikh communities in India, clearly if you're looking at minority communities which are actually antithetical to the theological, ideological, or ethnic stance of the majority, like Kosovar communities in Serbia, right, etc., Albanian communities in Serbia, etc., etc. In those cases, the majority of the population is not going to want to invest for a long time in culture that they perceive as antithetical to the primary culture. However, investment in economic incentives is actually something that it's much easier to get people on board with. Firstly, because there is a much more easily identifiable need on the other side, someone who is not having a good life and should be safe. Secondly, because that economic incentives lead more to integration. They have to do more with, like, more schooling. Sorry, just to clarify the sort of things that we want to invest in. Sorry, I will talk about that later, how it's likely to manifest. Just do that by analysis. And so we think less external resistance to that. I'll come to a few more reasons, but try and go. I would love to engage with you.
If you had to actively destroy or harm a community's culture to pursue economic development, like destroying their language and doing maximal degrees of assimilation, would you support that on your side of the house?
Firstly, yes, we think enhanced freedom to actually do what you want, enhanced economic integration is the only way to long-term preserve a culture. We think at the point at which Irish people actually have a functioning economy which is strong enough, maybe you could bring back Gaelic. But to try to artificially preserve Gaelic in like some spout of white British guilt, still under occupation, still under persecution, still under a lack of economic opportunity like the one Arab communities face in Israel or like the one Black American communities face in America, that's just a flat-out lie. That's just not something that's going to work in the long term. Something you can pretend to do, but then, first reason we mentioned, external resistance is going to get you. Second reason that's going to get you there, internal resistance. We say that the government is an actor that people don't like in that context. They don't like to see them intermingle in that culture. The sort of Arab internal culture that the Israeli government would like to promote, or the sort of Albanian culture that the Serbian government would like to promote, is something that the minority population is going to be extremely suspicious of, and they're going to be against taking that funding in very many cases, especially when that funding is likely to be conditioned on only developing the certain types of culture that government likes. Thirdly, we say it's really hard to just be effective there. Firstly, because culture is organic and developing, and the attempt to currently preserve what is currently going on in a certain like musaical way, like the sort of way they do it when with slum tourism in Brazil, for example, doesn't really enable the organic development of that culture because it doesn't empower people to participate in that culture by virtue of actually having the monetary backing and free time to do so with. Therefore, the only people participating in the culture are the only ones directly paid by the mechanism funding culture right now. They're the only people under that pyramid of let's give you the Native American tour of this or that reservation, rather than the vast Native American population being able to participate because they now are less alcoholic and now have more equal economic opportunities in general. Fourthly, we say it's immeasurable and therefore harder to justify to voters. You can't really say we manufactured this much culture, whereas economic improvement is measurable, therefore easier to justify a long time. Why do we think that's more important? Firstly, because it enables choice and agency. When you have more money, when you have more savings, when you have a personal safety net, you can actually make more choices with how you run your life. Go.
Do you think that there are certain kinds of policies that could help with the economic improvement of these minorities, but at the same time be still able to preserve their culture?
Like yes, but to that extent we don't see where those policies would necessarily factor into that debate, into this debate. Like obviously we're both for doing it. So firstly, agency, more personal safety nets, more savings, more opportunities for your kids, and more community leaders which can actually empower from within in a more wiser and actually informed way. Like, you know, I don't want to take like the extreme example where you say that the Oprahs of the world are just more effective than white senators at deciding which aspects of culture to preserve. And even if you don't look at that, even if you just look at like successful professionals giving back to their cultures, pulling people out, helping communities organize, that's just a lot more effective than governmental investment in that context, but it only happens if you gave those people the economic opportunities to succeed with in the first place. If even in the extreme cases where you have divergent language, you gave them the majority language to succeed with and to get economically empowered with. Second, we say the preserving culture often jails people in. If you're only ever taught the native, your native language in the Mexican indigenous community, you're not able to participate. And we say to the extent that that limits choice, even if it preserves culture, it's a bad thing. Tom will talk more about everything, but thanks.
Hi, fantastic here. Very good to welcome the leader of opposition.
The dilemma between the preservation of culture and the advancement of economic opportunities for minority communities is not, as the OG suggests, an all-in or either-or trade-off. It exists on a spectrum, which means that some things are things that we are perfectly prepared to defend, like ensuring that there's adequate schooling, even in subjects like math and science, in like indigenous communities on the one hand, but on the other hand, stuff that is mutually exclusive is the language that you might teach these things in, or the language that you would teach the arts and the humanities in. So for instance, we will still defend vernacular schools when we teach like subjects like history, political science, social studies, and so on and so forth. So we think that ultimately there is a spectrum which we have to acknowledge with regard to defending the economic advancements of these minorities on the one hand, but ensuring the preservation of culture on the other hand. We accept the trade-off that if you were to teach certain subjects in English, then quite obviously it will be a lot easier for these people to gain employment in the future, but we are prepared to buy the trade-off. Great. So, furthermore, what is this debate actually about? Because it's not merely about the preservation of monuments. It's not the only thing that will run as part of voting opposition's advocacy, right? It is not merely about the mutually exclusive distribution of resources on our side either. It's also about mutually exclusive policy, whereby certain measures that you take to improve the economic efficiency of this particular community runs directly counter to their ability to preserve culture, not merely in terms of resources, but in terms of things, for example, like tying welfare to seeking employment in an area that's perhaps outside of the local indigenous community, or the typical areas in which these minority communities live in, or relocation to these areas, depending on the particular context of the country that you are talking about. But before I move on, I'm going to take that clarification.
Yeah, so a lot of ethnic communities believe that having any form of Western education within their communities is a form of cultural destruction. Do you or do you not support having this?
Okay, so in that worst case scenario, we are prepared to support whatever the local communities want, but we also need to acknowledge that in the majority of these minority communities, I don't see African Americans protesting against school. Okay, right? So moving on. Great. So the first thing I want to talk about is in response to the idea that their policies are actually going to improve the economic conditions of minority individuals and minority communities. Before I move on to extension material, the first of which is simple, right? Like, we don't think that their policy of adopting maybe language policies in schools or other such policies is actually going to help these minority communities for two reasons. The first of which is political resistance, which they actually did briefly talk about, but they underestimate the effects of political resistance on the ability of minority communities to be able to integrate into the majority community, which is after all one of the key mechanisms by which they achieve economic effectiveness and economic opportunity in the long run. The reason for this is simple, right? Because at the point in time in which minority communities often find themselves starved in terms of resources on the basis that their schools don't teach in a certain language or don't conform to certain curriculum standards, rightly or wrongly, it may be, especially given the potentially divisive history of the particular country, it may be seen as something that runs counter towards their own particular interest. You talk about Tamil schools being deprived of funding because national language is Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, for instance. And sure, it may be economically beneficial to teach Tamil students Sinhalese because that's how you get jobs in Sri Lanka, but that may not necessarily be the right way to integrate minority communities into the majority community, into these countries, and in order for them to fit into their culture, ensure that they don't get discriminated, because the political resistance that happens as a result is only going to further divisions, and many politicians would take the opportunity to simply discriminate against these individuals in terms of policy and discriminate against these communities anyway. So political resistance and the political fabric of these particular nations is something that we have to take into account. The second thing is the constraint of generations, right? Like, sure, you can say that all math and science subjects are going to be taught in English in these particular schools, but given that you have entire generations and their parents who have been taught in a particular other language, who can only teach their children and help their children in another language, an entire generation of teachers who have been taught in another language, like the attempts in most countries to switch language policies or to promote economic advancement through policies like these directly impact the ability of entire generations of minorities to access economic opportunity in the short term. So to the extent that I assume that long-term economic advancement happens for these minority communities because we switch to a different language or anything else like that, there is a huge short-term impact that A, directly impacts an entire generation's ability to find jobs, and B, may not actually lead to long-term economic advancement because an entire generation has now been removed from economic opportunity and the advance and the promise of higher education, and therefore it is much harder for them to build the foundation necessary to help these minority communities in the long run. Moving on to substantive material. The first of which is why culture is inherently important, right? No, thank you. Because, look, it's not merely a marker of identity that keeps communities together. As important as that may be to the sense of well-being, to the sense of meaning and purpose in the world, to the reason why they even live in the first place. It is also important because the local communities, the language that they use, the cultural markers that they use, are important means by which they identify with each other, and important means by which they identify people who can help them with the problems that they themselves face in their own daily lives, in terms of social networks that help them find jobs, and other things like that are lost when cultures are not preserved. For example, when immigrant communities are forced to split up in urban centers in America or in Canada, for example, and they lose that social network that allows them to cope with a changing environment. But before I move on, yes?
How is this in any way comparative? Right, the parental generation will be shut out of economic opportunities. How is that worse than all generations being shut out of economic opportunities?
Okay, so that was the obvious answer the government team would give, right? The fact that it's one generation versus many generations. My contention is that A, the probability that the subsequent generations will actually benefit from your policy is not one, because the adjustment costs might be sufficiently huge that you may never ever get the benefits that you want to advocate for in the first place. And you've got to prove to us that the massive harms caused to this immediate generation, which is also subsequently responsible for raising the subsequent generations, will be overcome by the policies that you seek to talk about. Right, moving back to substantive argumentation. So obviously we've established that community and culture is important for the psychological well-being, the inherent sense of meaning and purpose of entire communities, and that's an inherent good, psychological good to millions of people, which you cannot get rid of. But I think more importantly, it's also about ensuring that you've got social networks and sufficient support groups that enable you to navigate the changing economic world in urban centers when cultures are no longer preserved, where you end up moving to urban centers in order to seek employment, where you are divorced quite literally and figuratively from the rest of the community. And that is bad, because if they want to talk about economic advancement, breaking down these support groups and isolating minority individuals by taking away their culture within these urban centers or within other parts of the country does no good for them, like getting connections necessary to get more job opportunities or education opportunities, or to allow them to fit in within the different culture of the majority group in these particular areas. And that hugely impacts their ability to achieve economic advancement in the long run. And it is this understated effect that happens to Tamil minorities in Sri Lanka, or Chinese minorities in Malaysia, or Ainu minorities in Japan, that prevent them from achieving economic advancement despite the imposition of the policies that they themselves have already talked about. For that reason, vote opening up.
I cannot speak for the village and welcome the deputy independent.
Okay? Here is a list of things that opening opposition never respond to and is damning for their case. First, no responses whatsoever to Nam's first claim that just the amount of money you're going to see, you're going to be able to invest in these communities reduces significantly under their side of the house, because it is immeasurable and therefore to justify the investment in culture, unlike economic investment. You can't say we have reduced the amounts of non-culture in existence. You'd have to, in order to palliate for people who hate that culture, hate those sort of communities, it is a lot easier to say, look, these people are now less dependent on the welfare system. These people are now, there's less unemployment in these societies, in these communities. You can't do that with cultural preservation and investment, meaning that you're going to see a shrink in the amount of investment. And even if you accept some of their claims that culture might be as important, or even significantly, or even slightly more important than economical improvement, you're just not going to see it at the end of the day, because the amount of money you're going to invest in shrinks significantly. No response whatsoever from opening opposition. Secondly, the easiness of investment and success in those areas. It is easy to improve economical condition. It is easy to create training centers. It is easy to create schools that teach differently. It is easy to bring teachers and material that is in the language of the majority, and it is to create a museum, to in a lot of cases, sustain a museum or actually understand what needs to be preserved in that sort of culture, especially, as Nam tells you, when there's little cooperation from within those communities when it comes to investing in a government they don't trust. All of those mean, again, it is extremely harder to be successful in this sort of investments, unlike economical improvement. Again, almost no responses whatsoever. Thirdly, the idea that just economical improvement allows them to choose to invest in their own culture. OO's claim is a part of our case. We just allow them to choose what they prioritize. Under our side of the house, when economic improvement succeeds, we're going to show again, and even more likely, they can choose to invest in preserving the culture. We give them the choice of whether to integrate back on what and how much to invest in, instead of a government that has no idea what these people want and is influenced by what the majority would like to implement, would do. They can just better under our side of the house. What do we get responses to, and I'm using it generously? Firstly, the idea that, firstly, note, most of the responses we get are just completely uncomparative. Even if you accept their case about it's harder to have economic improvement because the parents won't be able to help children at home, a couple of responses to that one. A, just the fact that you are going to have more accessibility to the internet, to teachers who can come teach there, to learning material that it doesn't have to be translated into a language that other people don't know. You just have more access to better materials. The idea that you can just access it yourself. We even don't know how parents are important in doing homework with these kids. Secondly, if they're bilingual, they can just translate it to their language. We don't think it's that significant. Thirdly, everything else that isn't children teaching in schools for the first 5 years. The idea that the parents themselves would have better jobs, more availability to talk that language, and just buy them better education in the long run, to have a roof over their home, I think is more important than helping them once a week maybe in math homework, which will be better also under our side of the house. Thirdly, they tell us, but look, culture is an important element of identity. We have no idea what that has to do with the debate, right? The things that you do within your home and family, I have no idea how government investment actually interacts with anyway. You can still have that part of your culture. Secondly, again, you will be better able to preserve those under our side of the house. Why? First, let's discuss why we think that in most cases, when government implements the policy of up, are likely to actually harm those cultures. A couple of reasons for that. In order for you to be palatable, in order for you to gain enough majority within the parliament, within your constituency, to pass these sort of investments, it does have to be palatable to an extent. And when that culture is directly in clash with the culture of the majority, it means that you have to make significant compromises on which sorts and which aspects of the culture are you going to promote. Sure. Those are likely not to be the parts most important to that community, but more likely to be the parts that are most palatable and most acceptable by the majority. Meaning the money that you invest there is likely to be A, very insignificant to what that community wants, but B, also in a lot of cases, harmful, because you're going to promote the parts of the culture that are actually most of the people within those communities don't like or actually oppose. Secondly, it is done through the eyes of the majority and how they perceive the world and that culture. Meaning, even if you have the best intentions, you are likely to significantly skew that culture in the way that you invest in it. No, thank you, I'll take you later. Thirdly, the idea that who you choose in order to promote, like when you choose to talk to someone in order to understand what the culture looks like, when you choose where to invest within that culture, again, for those reasons exactly, you're going to promote people who are not the local leaders who would be politically opposable, would be political opposition in a couple of years. They're going to be the ones who are most aligned with you and most in line with you, again, creating direct harm in a lot of cases for these communities. So even if they succeed, we think that's a bad thing under their side of the house. Before I move on, an extension, please, closing.
Why is it the case that these communities cannot have some degree of autonomy to decide whether they want to preserve their culture or pursue economic development, rather than it being a government-implemented mandate?
A, because that's not the comparative in the debate. B, and as we claim, we give them that. By having money to invest in your culture, you can decide how much you're willing to do in that. Why is it likely to succeed? A couple of reasons why I think it is extremely more cost-effective to invest in economics. A, there is more of an incentive for the majority to invest in economic improvements of these people. It is from the fact that they are going to now pay taxes instead of living on welfare when they have jobs, which means it is extremely easy to justify these sort of policies, and also extremely people are just incentivized by themselves to promote these sort of policies and promote and support them. Secondly, it is extremely easy to create infrastructure. It's extremely easy to teach people English when they know none. Just the idea that the idea that you have marginal returns are significant to our side of the house when you give them something out of the nothing. Creating infrastructure like roads, creating infrastructure like training centers are very easy. You need one teacher or two and a couple of computers to teach 40 people and make them more employable and significantly improve their situation in life. Moreover, we say, even if you don't accept that it is more likely to succeed and is more cost effective, we just say, or lastly on cost effectiveness, this also means that over time you need less investment in those areas, in those communities when their economic situation improves. Their side has to sustain it. They have to sustain the investment for decades in order for it to remain what they've implemented in the first place. We don't need to be dependent on government agencies for the next decade or two, and don't need to be dependent on society being benevolent enough. But lastly, we say, the idea that freedom of choice for the individuals within those communities, instead of being locked in by the preservation of a culture that they might not want at the end of the day. The idea that we get them out of debt spirals and they're able to buy education for their children at the end of the day. All of these are significantly better for them. Please propose.
Very much. Welcome the Deputy Chair of Office.
The problem with the government, I think, is that they assume that everyone wants to speak in English. They assume that everyone wants more economic enfranchisement, without necessarily recognizing that oftentimes to minority communities, it is far more important to them to prioritize and preserve the culture they've grown up in, even if it means at the expense of their ability to access better welfare or better goods at the end of the day. So let's firstly clarify what exactly our stance is. We are not saying that in all of these minority communities you should have absolutely no English schools whatsoever. We're also not saying that you should have absolutely no infrastructural development whatsoever. But what we are saying is that the point at which there is a trade-off where you have to coerce communities, for example, to take up those English language schools at the expense of their own vernacular schools, we are not happy to take that specific trade-off. That's why we don't think that everything that government was saying, for example, about how this means that they'll be left in abject poverty and the only way in which they're able to break out of their poverty cycle is via the commodification of their own culture, necessarily applies in this particular debate. So this deals with a lot of their arguments about political will and political funding, because we think that you can still direct that same kind of funding towards the creation of having those English language schools. No, thank you. But perhaps, for example, allowing those individuals the choice to be able to both attend that school, but also at the same time continue to practice their own culture and speak their own languages in certain subjects of that school or outside of those schooling areas. So we think that that still deals with the idea that we are working towards getting these people off of welfare. We still have the political will for these individuals to get money from things like Parliament and things like the Senate and the like. The second thing is that they told us that it's problematic because the comparative is that now the government invests in the culture of these places, and that's bad because then they only invest it based on the eyes of the majority and only emphasize on the parts that are important to them. But we would argue that certain cultures do choose to commodify themselves, and that's fine. So we allow them the choice, for example, to be able to do those things and make those investments on themselves. But to the extent to which they are arguing that comparatively that the government invests in their culture, I don't necessarily see why that's the case. So we are saying that if that particular minority wants to be left alone and they don't want that particular investment, or they don't want for the government to invest more money in their culture, we're happy to allow them to do that as well. So we're happy to say, for example, that they should be allowed to make those trade-offs for themselves, and they should be allowed to turn away the idea of economic improvement if the preservation of their culture is what they want, and we shouldn't be coercing them into making those choices. Yes?
Let's be clear. Opposition in this debate have to defend prioritizing culture over economic improvement. Opening opposition can't have a lot of English teaching and a lot of what governments want and just some culture. You have to defend the majority of the spending going toward culture that is unlikely to succeed, and is likely to harm that culture, and is just less helpful for those communities in the long run, as we've analyzed that you never respond.
Right. Okay, so that was exactly what I was saying. So I'm not saying about spending going to culture. I'm saying that the harms that you're talking about skewing culture as a result of funding going towards that culture is not necessary in this debate. What we are saying is that the point at which that particular culture of that particular community chooses to prioritize their culture over the idea of economic improvement and want to live in worse off economic conditions, we think that should be a choice they should be allowed to make. So why exactly is that the case? No. Firstly, why we think economic enfranchisement is not that important in this particular debate to these to minority communities. Firstly, we would argue, as Ade already told you, that often they limit to the extent of economic enfranchisement that these individuals are able to attain. At the point at which, for example, they still grow up in communities that are geographically separate or still practice cultures that are still somewhat separate from what the majority practices, at the point at which they still look different from the majority. While it might be true that via some form of assimilation on your side with all of these investments in schools and the like, they might be able to gain some level of economic improvement. The fact of the matter is that that economic improvement is ultimately limited by the way that the majority ends up continuing to oppress them or denying them opportunities because of these characteristics they still cannot control. Which is to say that the benefits that you are talking about are not unlimited or does not result in equality with the majority that you are talking about, but rather is an ultimate limit. At the end of the day, we don't think it's as valuable as you seem to put it up to be. The second thing is that we would want to argue, and this is what Adil told you about, that oftentimes culture can be incredibly important to these people, much more important than the idea of economic enfranchisement itself. And the reason why is because we think that to a large extent, their culture is the reason for why they were in the position that they were in the first place. That the majority, like you said, were able to point to them and say, these are the cultures that make them seem backward, these are the cultures that mean that they don't have the economic enfranchisement that they want, and this culture is the reason why they are different from us and they are worse off from us. As a result, the culture tends to be the means by which these individuals oftentimes gain a lot of solace and a lot of support from their communities as a whole, and that's the reason why we think, no thank you, having a government made up of the majority say that they're able to coerce these individuals into giving up that specific level of solace for themselves in exchange for an economic enfranchisement that they make the pronouncement is better than their culture is incredibly problematic. That was literally the principle behind why there was a lost generation in Australia where children were like, indigenous children were perhaps being like stolen away via the idea that we had to save these children from the indigenous parents, when perhaps the children would be much happier of being in a community that looks like them and practicing culture as them. Yeah.
Extreme examples aside, it's important for ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities to have their own culture. Does that make it fair to jail kids into that culture, be unable to leave, and be unable to have any actual choice on where they participate because the culture wants it?
So we're definitely not going to stand for like a culture coercing their people to stay within that culture. I think like if you're going to say that the stolen generation example is like extreme, then that's extreme as well. We're all for people having the choice to leave their communities if they so wanted to. But what we are saying is that the point at which that community wants to make the choice of their investment, we should allow them to do it. But then they told us that now with the community being more economically enfranchised, this means that they are now better able to make the choice to be able to like re-establish or preserve those cultures. We don't think that's the case. Like if you want to look at like even Singapore as an example, right? Oftentimes when you try to create economic improvement at the expense of culture, once culture is gone, it never comes back. So for instance, when you stop an entire generation from the ability to speak a particular dialect or communicate with their parents in a particular way, for example, you are never going to be able to get those languages back because there's no way for you to preserve those particular languages. Oftentimes it is oral traditions, they are not written down. There's no way for you to get those things back. There are certain cultural practices by which if you don't like practice them from young, it's very difficult for you to understand those cultural practices later on in the future as well. Which is to say that it is not true that money is able to like reawaken those cultures in yourself, and to the extent to which they could, if you're talking about a generation that has had no exposure to those particular kinds of culture, the way in which you try to revive those cultures is exactly what opening government says, which is that you look at that culture via some sort of exoticized lens because you don't actually understand or practice that culture, which means they end up being lost in the midst of time precisely because of these economic improvements that you wanted to do so, that coerce individuals to stop or cut off those kinds of those aspects of their culture a lot faster. So to be clear, what we are saying is that we are happy to say that over time perhaps it's probably easier for you to get buy-in from these individuals if you allow them the choice to choose between like a slow or more moderated pace of improvement for themselves via the creation of options for these people. But the point at which you coerce them into cutting off those parts of their culture and moving forward way too quickly, you lose those cultures irreversibly. We think that's bad for those communities. We're happy to oppose.
We thank that speaker very much and welcome the member of the lecture.
Okay, so prioritizing economic growth probably doesn't mean destroying all culture. It probably doesn't mean absolutely no consultation with the minority community whatsoever. Sometimes there's going to be no trade-off between economic growth and culture. In that case, it's not in the debate. It's about where there is some degree of trade-off. It is probably going to be marginal, but we think that is ultimately what we should be doing. In terms of economic policy, I think there's a number of things that we really should make clear from this essay. We don't have to support policies which we know don't work. We don't support things that chase false indicators, like trying to raise GDP, but don't actually improve people's lives. We think we do what materially improves people's lives and gives some multiplier effect to the community. And to be again clear, this is important for what OO said. Economic improvement is usually about investment in the community itself, about building factories, about providing massive tax incentives for businesses to set up there in the first place. It's not exclusive. It's one weird thing about education that apparently is going to be done in a way that destroys all forms of culture. I'm going to talk about two arguments in the speech. First, I'm going to deal with education and culture, effectively going to be a sustained rebuttal of what we heard from opening opposition. Secondly, I'm going to talk about specific aspects of economic improvement and why it actually empowers communities and gives them choice in a way that is very different to what our opening said. Firstly, education and culture. The education of opening opposition is not only going to be one of the most minor aspects of this investment, because realistically schools in relative terms don't cost that much. But everything they said only seems to stand if you invest in the single most stupid way possible. So like, just think about there being one language. I have absolutely no idea why you wouldn't just do what pretty much any form of normal investment would be, which is keep it in the vernacular and then have lots of English lessons as well. And have people learning in the language they're going to learn best at. Because for all the reasons they say these communities are going to be harmed in the future if they're not able to fully engage with their forms of schooling, is all the reasons why it would be stupid to do that, and no government would reasonably consider that to happen. We think doing things in a way that stops all generations from benefiting would be something that is idiotic, and we wouldn't recommend doing it. In terms then of losing their culture, which is the second aspect we hear out of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, it's again kind of bizarre because the mechanisms of how it happens are asserted and never explained. Apparently, oral traditions disappear. I have no idea why people in these communities stop telling each other stories, stop passing down these oral traditions. There is no reason you would stop doing that, and I think it probably would continue. They say some things might be lost. Okay, in abstract, something might be. But here's what's important. That's not necessarily a harm. Because what cultures are things that are not static, but change over time. Things are lost, things are added, and it is meant to be about reflecting at people and how they respond to the challenges of their time. It's about a link with what people before you did, but also about your present situation. It changing isn't important, because you can still find meaning in it. The value of culture is not a priori, it is about what people choose to gain from it. And a situation where your culture is relevant to you at the moment and where you are able to live your life as you want is something that we think gives people greater agency and greater happiness in their life, and given that's what we care about in terms of culture, we think that's something that is better. Second argument, economic improvement. We think economic improvement is something more than just numbers on a screen. It is the capacity to be able to make choices, to purchase goods and services, to live an independent life, and to not live in a state of deprivation that leaves you open to exploitation. This is going to have three implications that I think are important. The first one is going to be about capacity to have an independent culture, secondly about exploitation, and thirdly about the choice of individuals. And it will be different from what you guys say, so knocking is helpful, but also futile. Firstly, capacity to have an independent culture. I think this is something that is actually important. The vast majority of the Maori population in New Zealand, the vast majority of the Native American population in the USA, don't live on the reserves that have been set up for them. The vast majority are second and third generation, and they live in normal cities, and they pretty much are isolated from their original cultures. The reason that they're in large cities is because there's a lack of economic opportunity in the reserves or within their own original communities. They're forced to leave because they have no alternatives but to do so. And once they do leave, it's pretty much impossible to go back, because going back is returning to a place that you were pretty much cut off from, because you are the person who left and abandoned that culture. But it's also one where your economic situation would so materially change the worse that no one can realistically do that. Fine, Trent.
Doesn't this illustrate the concentrated minority populations that still exist, like the frontier Australian reserves, are ones that have actively chosen to preserve their culture against assimilating and gaining those economic benefits you want?
No, we think it's probably because governments are quite racist and have never invested in the past, and we recommend some degree of economic investment in the future. So what does this mean? Is that the vast majority of populations ultimately become isolated from their community, because their descendants are never able to gain access to that community, or at the very least it's extraordinarily hard for them to gain access to that culture. But they still have the loss of knowing they are a part of that, but are separated from it. We think that's something that is a harm. We think this is most obvious for isolated communities, but the general logic applies to any form of minority community anywhere in the world. Assuming we get any form of reasonable government investment in these communities that builds infrastructure there, that allows you to have an economic life that is reasonable in that community itself, we think people have better qualities of life. Because that means that fewer people are forced out of that community, and more people are able to retain a connection that they see as meaningful with people they have grown up with, and we think that's something that is beneficial. We think for everyone as well, it means there's a possibility where you could potentially transition back into that community, because it is something where there's economic abilities for you to do so. It's still going to be difficult, but it's less difficult, and that's something that is with. Secondly, even if we ignore all of this, for the people who are still forced out, which is what they seem to be exclusively caring about, their lives are still better because they have greater forms of economic opportunities themselves, they have the ability to live a life, they have greater reason value because they gain more control over themselves and over their future. We think that's something that is still a win for our side and are happy for it. Okay.
Right, so at a point at which, for example, communities absolutely do not want you to enter with your English schools or refuse to attend those English schools, will you still coerce individuals to attend or enroll into these schools?
So we think realistically forcing people to do something where we expect there to be massive backlash, and to the extent you're talking about where they literally refuse to go into schools and presumably run away from them, is probably something where there is no economic benefit of doing it. We don't think it's ever going to be that extreme. We think it is a case of what we prioritise, not a case of bring in the army and force people to do things they clearly don't want to. We don't think that's realistically this debate. Second argument, exploitation. This is actually kind of important. Without specific government funding, many minority communities live in a state of deprivation. Reasons normally along the lines of historic oppression, the fact they're very isolated from the majority, means there is no economic growth in these areas without an influx from governments. What this means is that those who are left in these areas need to take any form of economic opportunities available, because they never know, there's never any certainty there'll be others available, but also when it comes to choosing what you can do, you usually only have one choice. And when you are in a state of impoverishment, where there is only one corporation ahead of you, that's not a choice to go into it or not, you have to deal with it. So what this ultimately looks like is things like the Amazonian Wampas community being forced to sell their lands to ExxonMobil and foresters, losing all aspects of the community because they literally have no other alternatives but to sell to these corporations. Opening government notes economic improvement directly impacts the ability of communities to choose what they want to prioritise. We're going to show more than this. It's imperative to invest, as without it you face private exploitation from these individuals because they have no multiplicity of corporations they can choose which are actually beneficial for them, but simply those that are rapacious and destroy their communities. It is only with economic opportunity and security that you get the options to invest in your community in the future. Thirdly, individual choice. The ability to buy into one community and its tradition is a choice. The ability to opt out of it is also a choice. We think we should care about the economic aspects and prioritise that, because even if it does come with some trade-off, an individual not being able to go into their culture as much, it unlocks so many more choices, because ultimately economic opportunity is the ability to do anything else with your life, to go into any job you want, enter into any other city, and to be honest, even the ability to ultimately move to other countries, because it's much easier to move if you have money and look like you're able to get a job in these places. Culture is important, it is one choice. There are more choices in people's lives. Every choice can be as meaningful. We think giving people the greatest number of choices possible is important. So even if there's a trade-off, we still win it. I'm very happy.
Ready? 4 strategic errors of the government in this round. Firstly, they neglect the fact that there are other companies and private actors who are willing to provide the exact economic investment that they want on their side of the house. Private companies are always going to want to invest in communities because they get a return on their investment. So if you look at Canada, Aboriginal communities have been able to get massive economic investment from private corporations, where they basically bargain with that private corporation, get a set amount of their people working on construction sites, or working on lumber, or using some resources that exist within their communities and selling those to private corporations. This will exist on our side of the house as well, guaranteeing a degree of economic investment. This means that the comparative is not no economic investment on our side of the house versus economic investment on theirs, but economic investment through private actors or economic investment through the government. This is critical for the comparative, because their side isn't just providing economic investment. It has to provide it at the cost of culture. Things like only providing schools that teach in that main language because it maximizes your ability to integrate. Doing things like attempting to push more moderate forms of your culture because that's what's able to make you be more acceptable in society and thus more available within the local job market. Or critically, the extreme example that I think is really relevant in this debate, things like frontier reservations in Australia, where Aboriginal communities can choose to live their own natural life that would have existed before colonization, free from the constraints of Western society if they want to do so. On their side of the house, they get rid of these, force them into the cities to live a more economically productive life, and destroy the culture that they have developed. That is the true comparative that you have to recognize in this debate. It's not just about language, it's about fundamentals of that culture in favor of minor economic benefit that you don't exclusively get on their side. Second strategic error that they make. They laugh at the argument about choice and agency by saying it's not the comparative in this debate. But you have to recognize something. The minority communities that exist right now already have a revealed preference for their culture. So the individuals who have chosen to live in the frontier reservations in Canada and Australia have self-selected to prioritize their culture above their economic development. CG gives you this analysis too, but they talk about individuals in Maori communities who choose to leave and go live in the cities to pursue economic development. This means that they can choose to pursue economic development if they want to. The question is whether we should give funding to the minority communities that have already self-selected to want to prioritize their culture more, or destroy that community and destroy that revealed preference on their side. And this is really critical. Because they never tell me why more funding has inherent value or why economic development has inherent value. If I get X thing, but I do not want X thing, that thing has absolutely no value to me, especially when it comes to the cost of something I actually truly desire. Given we are dealing with communities that have already shown that they truly desire their culture over the economic alternatives that already exist, we think it is less utile, less beneficial for them, for their side to destroy that culture in favor of economic development they do not truly want. Thirdly, Gov assumes that money later down the line is actually going to be able to repair the damage they do. The problem is that it can't. Maybe you can get a museum with the extra money, but you can't make sure that your culture is able to survive when you've destroyed the language, when you've created an entire generation that doesn't remember the deeds of their ancestors and the past. Fourth strategic problem. Thanks, CG, for conceding that your case is marginal. This is really nice for us, because it means that the benefit you get on their side is minimal. At best, compared to the cases that I've already talked about in my speech, where there is such massive harm to these individuals, their identity, and their sense of self. I think we already win on that ground. I think that is enough to win opposition in this debate already. But I want to deal with some stuff that we get coming out of GovBench generally about agency, and why they do not actually maximize agency and actually harm it to a larger degree. Why is this the case? Firstly, recognize that truly valuing agency would be valuing the choices that they have already made, treating the communities that have already self-selected to preserve their culture as if they have made a legitimate decision. This is not what Gov does, right? Gov treats them as a paternalistic actor. They assume they've made the wrong choice and decide that they know better for them. If there's anything that rehabilitates that colonialist narrative that we know better than you, it is that kind of paternalistic approach to communities that already have this revealed preference. So they don't even truly value agency. Second, recognize there are already offsetting factors. So the concern that they have is that culture can jail you, and thus that can restrict your agency, whereas economic choice can allow you the full basket of available options. But recognize that this jailing is already massively mitigated against in modern society. And that's because the mere presence of an alternative, the mere availability that you can move to the city to work, the mere availability that there are some schools that exist all over the place that will be able to teach you English if you want to opt in to that choice, means that you are not trapped into your culture unless you want to remain within that society. This means that individuals are not truly trapped. They choose to opt into that thing, which means that agency is not truly harmed. Yep?
Muslim communities are not CO's one special case. Muslims in the suburbs of Paris have no revealed preference. They just don't have money to move to the center of Paris. Even in those cases,
okay, this is just like, sorry, this is not true, given that often Muslim communities opt to go together so that they have increased religious connection, they're able to have more people in their community who speak their language, who come from their cultures back home so that they feel more safe. Like, it's not just that they're all super poor people and thus have no ability to choose. And even if that is the case, we can have things like giving them welfare money so that they have the options to move without destroying their culture in any significant degree. Actually, yeah.
So like individual choices are not necessarily reflected by your community's nominal receipt or revealed preference. If you're born into the Western frontier, you get no education. You choose to stay or you leave for a subsistence job. That's not really a choice. If instead you have economic opportunity to start your life, you can always choose to go back and some
like this is just absolutely not true, given that you can choose to opt into the free schooling system that the government will provide for you, but the government will also provide you investment to preserve your culture for the community that already exists. So you're not, just no. Lastly, agency requires safety. Recognize that minority communities often face discrimination and oppression in their societies. But you cannot truly have free agency to choose the life you want to live unless you feel safe actualizing that agency. You feel safe interacting with members of the majority culture. When does this occur? It occurs when you have some place that you can return to where you feel safe, where you have a sense of belonging, a support system, people who have like experiences to you, who will sympathize with the experiences that you have. This is critical, because it means that they don't actually get full agency on their side of the house. They isolate people in a bubble of one away from the culture that actually would have provided their life meaning. Their side values agency, they don't get it, and they don't actually understand what the true comparative in this debate is. Proud to oppose.
Wonderful. Thank you very much and welcome the government representative.
opposing government claims is the best way to opt into a culture that people truly value is to give them the choice to leave. Because this debate is about preservation of culture, and I think it's something that you really need to take into account, right? It's not about the complete and utter destruction of that culture. Their side of the house needs to preserve the status quo of how culture is like. That means investing in keeping cultures the way they are, or not investing at all in allowing those communities to live as they will, the western frontier that Trenton talks about. What we claim to you on our side of the house is that investment very often will change that culture. It very often will not preserve that culture. That culture will change. Maybe those cultural ties will weaken. But our point is that through economic investment, you allow people to make the decision over whether or not they want to go back to those communities. To go back to a community that is rich, that is empowered, that they can live in and they can be proud of being part of. Instead of having to be driven out of those communities because of poverty, to go work a terrible menial job in the city where they have to destroy their roots because preservation of culture means preservation of poverty. I've got 3 things to talk about in the speech. First of all, the link between economic empowerment and culture and how we specifically win both of those things from closing Gulf. Second of all, on the idea of choice as presented by closing up, and lastly, on the idea of private companies and investment as well as exploitation. So, the link between economic empowerment and culture. This is the main extension that Al gives to you in his speech. What do we hear from Trenton on this? He says, but it's clear that people can leave because by our own argument, people can, from Native American communities can leave and go to other areas and sever those cultural roots. Yes, that is true, and yes, some communities will decide to remain on their own. But the point is, the decision on both sides is terrible, right? Your decision is either for an ethnic Cherokee to leave his community and to go out into a city like New York and to work a menial job, or to remain in that community and to remain incredibly poor. That is a terrible decision that they have to make. And some communities will leave. Yes, some communities will stay, like the frontiers. But in both cases, it's a terrible decision, right? The difference here is we provide a third option, which is to empower those communities from within and to invest within those ethnic communities themselves. That means they don't have to leave in a chance to hopefully seek some sort of economic empowerment in the future. But they can remain at home if they so desire, because the enclave that they've grown up in happens to be economically empowered, right? I think the difference here is, yes, the culture in those areas might particularly change, right? But the point is that people do value their culture. That changing culture can be preserved, right? They can do things like invest into these kinds of communities with their own money. They can do things like go home and celebrate despite being rich people, right? These are things that I think both government teams talked about, and we never heard really a response from opposition. So, back to Al's argument, and why this is incredibly important, right? We recognize that people very often leave, and that is how you sever cultural ties. It is when people, like the Cherokee, are driven out of their own reserves and have to go to New York, where they can't go back because they're stigmatized for going back, then is when you destroy culture. On our side of the house, yes, culture might change. Culture might change because people may be less familiar with the language. But the point is, if they still value that culture in and of itself, they can always go back and celebrate those cultures. And here's the thing, right? They talk a lot about choice, and I think a lot of people talk about choice here. But the choice should be about the individual and whether they value culture. Because I think what I'll basically say to you a lot is culture is important to lots of people, and we agree. And so we empower them to make those decisions over whether or not they want that culture to remain. Now, on to the rest of the debate. About choice, right? We heard a lot about choice in this debate, and I think opposition, both opening up and closing up, basically say very often people decide they want to live in poverty within their own cultural communities, and they should be allowed to do so. What Al specifically tells you in rebuttal is that the ability to make that decision is often not something that is reflective of what people want. One, people in future generations might not want that. People who are children, who don't have a voice when it comes to deciding things when it comes in tribal council, for instance, or when they have to interact with the government of that particular country. That interaction is not something that children, for instance, have a voice in, or women in a lot of places, or disempowered people within those communities who we think suffer the worst from poverty and suffer the worst from being locked into those places and suffer the worst from having the lack of economic empowerment, right? People who make those decisions are often people who reap the benefits of being within those kinds of communities, and we give a voice to those people who can make those things happen. No thanks. But second of all, right, on culture, right, and the idea of culture being valuable, I think this harks back again to our extension of why it's so incredibly important. Sure, culture might be important to people. The point is, right, you destroy some aspects of culture, but you can always revive it in the long term, right? I think what opposition basically try to tell you, and something that I think is incredibly false and unproven from their side of the house, is that the moment you try to not preserve culture or invest economically at the expense of culture, you must wipe out that culture. That is untrue, right? You can teach the language vernacularly, as Al pointed out to you, while still teaching the main language in school. I don't see why that is in any way bad, right? I grew up bilingual, a lot of people grew up bilingual, and it's perfectly fine. Before I go on,
you say preserving culture is preserving poverty, but the Salish community in Canada, the Iranian community in Europe, and Jewish communities throughout the world are incredibly wealthy, but still were able to preserve their culture, because governments gave the autonomy for them to do it, while economic factors made them rich.
Sure. They fall out the debate because they're already economically empowered, right? But we're talking about the 90% of communities who are locked in and who lack economic empowerment, which is what this debate is about. So why does our extension win this debate, right? The reason it wins is because it cops all of the things that they talk about. They want choice, they want culture. We give them the ability to choose to opt into that culture. We give them the ability to preserve that culture. What you instead get on their side of the house is a lack of culture. When many of those communities are forced out of their homes, they leave to the cities, and that is where you get the crumbling cultures we see across America when it comes to native culture. Before I go on to private companies and exploitation, yes?
Right, so is your benefit in this debate just for individuals within communities that don't want this external intervention, the ones within these specific communities that want to leave? Is that the group that you're trying to help?
I mean, that happens to be a lot of people, considering these are very rarely democratic institutions that are run by everyone, and considering we're talking about the most vulnerable in these communities, we're happy to say that's the people we're trying to protect. Okay, private companies and exploitation. The argument we get out of Trenton is that a lot of private companies can invest in these kinds of places, and as a result, you get a substitute for government investment. One, we pointed out you often get exploitation from these kinds of private companies. And the reason for it is because they very often have an incentive to do so, right? Considering A, these communities are often insular, lack contact with the outside world, and probably have little knowledge of things like jurisprudence, it means it becomes very difficult for these companies to stand up for themselves when they have things like exploitation. Two, it means that these companies depend on these native reservations or ethnic communities end up depending on these kinds of companies, which leads to greater exploitation because their only source of income and their only source to avoid having the terrible suffering from terrible poverty. On our side of the house, the government may not be perfect, but we think there's a better system of checks and balances there, when the government has no necessary ulterior motives when it comes to exploiting these particular people, right? That means, on their side of the house, yes, you might get private companies to alleviate some form of poverty, but that often comes with an incredibly large negative baggage that comes with exploitation. But secondly, we just don't buy the fact that these kinds of private companies often don't destroy culture in the first place. It's why if you look at most of the most culturally insular communities that care the most about preserving their culture, they often don't interact with a lot of these kinds of external companies, or have to only do so with great reluctance. And that's because even interacting with these kinds of people, having them build on your sacred soil, for instance, or cutting down your trees to build their factories is often something that's incredibly destructive towards their culture. We don't see on their side of the house as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we best preserve choice, we provide choice, we preserve culture the best, we prevent exploitation. Incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, speaker, very much, and welcome to the offering.
Four things in the speech. Firstly, what do these communities want? Secondly, what is the net amount of money we get? Thirdly, how is that money used? Fourthly, what are the long-term impacts? Firstly, what do these communities want? We tell you that this debate has to focus on minority communities. So Alistair says, oh, there are some minorities and they're heavily integrated into the city and they live like ordinary people and they don't live in a minority area and they kind of married a white person and they mixed into the community. At that point, you are not a minority community. You are not living to some extent within an enclave or within an independent area. At that point, you have abandoned your culture and community and made an active choice to leave, and therefore you benefit from welfare systems, from education systems. You are not the people in this debate. There are two situations that I think are in this debate. Firstly, people that live entirely separately. Again, we're told they're a tiny group. I mean, in New Zealand, I'm not even sure this is true in the first place, but there are also massive groups of people living independently. So, like Aboriginals in Australia, many people have tried to reclaim their land and move away from the state because they found the systems that existed within that state incredibly oppressive and horrible places to live in. There are massive amounts of First Nation groups in Canada that do the same thing. These groups that live entirely separately are not that distinct or a tiny group in this debate. But secondly, there are minorities that live in an area within a city. So I know that. So there are neighborhoods in San Francisco. There are ethnic minorities minorities who have chosen to live in a specific area within a specific inner city. We think in this situation, you have still actively chosen to live in that particular area and maybe that place your home. So let's talk about the first group, so Group A, and why we think these communities will want to preserve their culture as opposed to abandoning it. So, if you had your land stolen, if you've been oppressed by the government, and if you have gone through a historical terrible process where your land was forcibly taken away from you, it seems very likely to me you're not going to want the government coming in and providing jobs which do not benefit you. So I think in many cases, you are happy to take a cut to the amount of money that you make, depending on who that money goes to. So if you are self-sufficient and providing money and goods for yourselves in your own community, even if you have less money, that is better than providing money and going back to benefit a corporation or a government agency who's going to profit from your labour or is going to provide you jobs for you. We think in many cases, this process goes through some of the historical harms that have happened to these communities and not things they want to witness again. On the second group, though, we think that often, if you're a minority living in a particular area in a city, that place was initially often the only place in which you could live. We think now, welfare in cities and education in cities means that you could choose to live to other places, or you could choose to send your child to a mixed school or send them elsewhere, but you don't, because in the face of oppression, you constructed that area to be your home. You have certain markets, you have certain bars in certain gay areas of San Francisco, for example. These are things that you created in the face of that oppression and not things that you want to give up. If you wanted to integrate into our society, you would have done that because you still have access to jobs and schools, even if they're less well funded, so you could move out. Those groups have to be chosen to be there. Why might you prioritise your culture over your economy? Firstly, safety. In many cases, you still are facing discrimination, and you have much lower chance of being subjected to violence or slurs or insults if you can live within a group of your own. Secondly, political enfranchisement, because if you are in a particular area and congregation, you can choose to work out the way in which your particular area is managed. You can choose to determine how those political funds are allocated versus being a tiny minority in a majority area and never having any political agency. Thirdly, if you're looking at separate communities, like Aboriginal groups, for example, you often want to determine the way your community is structured, so how your political representatives operate, how your justice system operates. So you have models of restorative justice versus a punitive criminal justice system. We're told that, oh, well, you never get any choice, and you wouldn't have chosen to live in those places anyway. What about future children? Future children are brought up in these communities. They are socialised with the norms that exist in those communities. Therefore, given the choice, they would still opt to live in those communities because it's what they have known and grown up with. It's what they've been told to value and be important. So I'm unclear whether this random kid who grows up in a First Nation community longs for the West when it isn't a thing they've ever been taught to value. Economic investment destroys those structures because if you want to make those communities effective and the most effective economically and the most productive, you have to abandon elements of your culture. If you want to get external investment, you can't have separate models of justice or a separate justice system, what the rest of society uses. You can't have a separate political structure. You could change those community structures and change the way things work in there. So you might say for Muslim communities, for example, that it's not good if you wear a hijab because that makes you less employable for corporations to exist and you won't get jobs. In those situations, they take away that crucial part of people's identity. So, secondly, on the net amount of money, we get two claims from OG. The first is we get more money because we can show the benefits. We can show benefits on our side too, e.g. a political community who aren't protesting, who aren't saying, I'm having the worst time ever, who aren't protesting against the things that have been given to them. If I get loads of funding but I complain about it, I won't get more investment. I'll take opening now.
SEA won't get political capital for the programs they want. Therefore, on their side, you get the chance to move to NYC and Dragon Uber, whereas on our side, you actually get economic investment in your community.
I literally just responded to this by saying that if people complain about the funding they're given, you'll give them less money in the future because they seem unhappy and ungrateful for it. Do you have a response to that?
Are you actually offering me a POI? That seems like a negligible minority of cases. Really, in most cases, people rather like money and would be quite happy getting it.
So I was thinking about analysis about why people have such preferences and why they often choose to disregard money when it is helping someone else and not helping them, and why we can't put our own lens on what people want. So therefore, no, just taking my two POIs, sucker. So, secondly, why it's easier to, they tell you it's easier to invest and do draining. Again, not if the community are hostile. Again, if you feel like a group is invading your area when you've actively chosen to shut them out, you don't listen to them, you don't get that. On our side, it's net greater. Why? Because private corporations can come in, whereas only the state will preserve culture because nobody else has the incentive to do that or the incentive to care about it. Because states don't always think in numbers, whereas corporations always do, and there is a community and a labour force that you can profit from as a corporation do that. Then we're told they have no power or agency because this is little sad people who can't think for themselves and can't negotiate. I think if you're trying to open yourself up to investment, you can probably look at different offers and leverage people against each other. Also, many First Nation groups in Canada have made bucket tons of money by living on land which has oil on it, and then selling that land to corporations by having the ownership rights to it. So next point, how is that money used? OG say AHA will preserve all the bad cultures, will put bad culture leaders in place. Firstly, no, because we support funding people to choose what they want to preserve. But secondly, the harm is symmetric if they want to do that, because you could have bad types of funding and bad types of investment. If the state hate the group that much, you'll give them really low wages and have really high profits going back to the majority, so they can't have that either. And I've just brought into CG stuff on exploitation. Briefly on the long-term stuff, finally. So we're told, oh, well, the culture's not lost forever, because you can still teach them their own language at home. Notice that if you're having schools in English, many people can understand and listen to that language well, but cannot write it. So loads of second-generation immigrants cannot write in their language. So also, if you persuade people to ban a religion and stop wearing hijab like opening government keep tapping every time I say it, which sounds pretty terrible, you cannot get that religion back. That is the most effective way to integrate and get economic development when you assimilate to the majority. Those are things you cannot get back because you cannot relearn a religion or re-go into it at a state. This is a horrible idea and very proud to oppose.